Oh yeah, man, that was a 2 a.m. wake up call today to do the session. In fact, 1.5, like 1 a.m. in the morning, getting up to do a session with Australia. I had to cross it off my list though. So I had two firsts. One was a session in Australia, although virtual, and then a session in the middle of the night. And it went very well. I didn't mess my codes. I didn't mess my slides. I must have finished on time. I was like, oh my God, I made it. And then I crashed back in my bed. But yeah, we're covering all time zones now, 24/7. If you guys have a request about us turning up somewhere in the middle of nowhere and doing a session, we are there. I proved it. Yeah, and more coffee. Coffee, please. Yep. Not gonna help because they can still bang on the door, man. I mean, it is what it is.
You're welcome. Thanks very much. So normally I run workshops and get to fly around the world, so I don't have to do things like wake up at 1 a.m. to do webinars with Australia. But with the whole COVID thing, that's kind of stopped. So no workshops, no traveling. So I've been working a lot on Structurizer, writing lots of code and adding features and things like that, really. Yeah. So I guess the easiest way to explain it is that it's an online software architecture diagramming tool. I'm actually going to caveat that it's not a diagramming tool; it's a modeling tool. But if I say modeling tool, people immediately switch off because modeling is horrible and evil, and something we did in the 1990s. But the easiest way to explain it is if you want to draw like two architecture diagrams at two different levels of abstraction, if you're using a tool like Visio, you draw two pictures, don't you? And then what happens when somebody wants you to change a name of one of the boxes, you have to change it both times on both diagrams. The problem comes when you only remember to update one of those diagrams, because then your two diagrams drift out of sync. Structurizer kind of fixes that problem because it allows you to build a centralized model of your stuff. So components and relationships, for example, and then you kind of drag those things onto a diagram canvas. And that's it really. So it's specifically designed for my C4 model. So the C4 model is an abstraction first hierarchical technique for software architecture diagrams. And yeah, it's really a tool to help people diagram and communicate and visualize their architecture. That's Structurize it in a nutshell, I guess.
Before we move on, JP, I think we are both muted, me and you. I don't think our sound is coming on the stream. So up until this point, Simon has been talking to himself. Oh, I am not muted. You are muted, so I can take the questions. Yes. He's still learning. It is Tuesday already. Yes, it is, man. Sorry, Brown. Sorry, Simon. We kill your mojo there, right? Now, you did say architecture, and I have to ask, why architecture? Like, I'm writing codes. I know what I'm doing. Why do I really need software architecture or, design or anything upfront? or do I need to do it up front in order for me to be successful?
It's one of those interesting and sometimes controversial topics, isn't it? Because back if we go back 20 years, we used to do the whole waterfall thing, and there was an explicit design phase and explicit analysis phase, and we have to go through these steps and produce these documents and hit these milestones and whatever.
Yep.
And then Agile came around, and Agile kind of said, well, you're spending so much time doing all this stuff, which is not resulting in code. What happens if the customer changes their mind? Oh, guess what? You've just burnt £10 million and then the rest is history.
Yep.
So Agile came around, and as you folks well know, it's all about delivering working software quickly and getting feedback and that sort of thing. And that's all great, but I think a lot of people misinterpreted the whole Agile Manifesto thing to say Agile says don't do design. And so when you talk to people now, there is this perception of, because we're doing modern Agile development, there's no need to do architecture. I actually ran a workshop a couple of years ago for quite a well-known company, and I ran my architecture course. And about halfway through this architecture course, one of the senior developers piped up and said, "Excuse me, how does all of this fit into the way that we work? Because we do extreme programming." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, when one of our customers or users gives us, or when they want us to build something, they give us a feature request and we just go and code it." So my response was, "Well, how's that working out for you?" And they said, "Well, it's not really very good. That's why we got you here." I'm like, "Well, there you go. You perhaps need to do some thinking up front." And it turned out that this team were just kind of like code swarming around an idea. And they would do lots of prototyping for like 3 or 4 days without any direction. And then they'd kind of put that into production. That's a bit scary, I know.
Oh, wow.
And then like a few days later go, "Oh no, that was completely wrong." And they reverse engineer, refactor the whole thing. I said, "Well, all of that code you've just written, if you spent 15 minutes together in front of a whiteboard to just map out a direction, that might save you like 4 or 5 days of active coding and refactoring." They were like, "Oh, that's a really good idea." I mean, wow, that's not a lot of time, is it, compared to the meetings?
JP, people still can't hear you. Why?
I can hear you both, if that counts.
And thanks, Simon. And by that, I take it that Agile does not mean that you don't do software architecture or you don't do any design upfront. It just means that you spend less time planning for the specific sprint that you're working on or for the specific features, and you come up with a design that fits the overall goal, and then you move from there. Is that how you recommend people doing it, or?
You've got a couple of options. I'm kind of hesitating here because it's not a kind of easy answer. So as with most things, it depends, and you got a couple of different options here. The one I see a lot of people do is they kind of start coding immediately, and then they say, "We're going to do emergent design or evolutionary architecture." And I have to air quote that because that's not what it means sometimes. And they kind of deliver stuff, and then they have a release, and then next sprint they deliver more stuff, hopefully have a release, and eventually they get to where they want to get to. And that can work. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of material out there about evolutionary architecture. There's a great book by Neil Patrick and Rebecca Parsons, and that can work, but it's really hard because if you don't take decisions, or you take decisions without looking far enough into the future, you end up either running into lots of refactoring or lots of technical debt because you're often trying to move too fast. So the approach I generally recommend is some upfront design, and we can have a discussion about what some means in air quotes. So I tend to kind of, let's do some upfront design. Let's figure out what the major building blocks are, what the major architectural drivers are, the major performance requirements we have to meet, or security, appropriate for you folks, of course. And then let's use that as a starting point. And the key phrase here is starting point. So once we start doing our sprinting and delivering code, I'm more than happy for our direction to change, because we're learning, we're getting feedback, we're delivering new features, people might change their mind. But I still want any changes to our direction that we set to be done in a justified manner. So this isn't random people on the dev team just pulling stuff off the internet or using new services because they fancy or because it's fashionable, microservices. Things need to be done for a reason. So that's really my approach.
Go, JP. Take this one.
So on that topic, which I'm pretty sure my audio is working now, but so on that topic, of course, microservices have sort of taken over the world. It feels like, at least in terms of hype and in terms of what we see people talking about. And for the past few years, we've seen lots of blog posts and lots of articles and lots of videos and discussions and conference talks and everything else about the beauty of the beauty of microservices and how much they solve every problem that's in modern software development. And then a few years after that, we see the microservices kind of didn't work out for us. So we went back to a monolith, and I think it was Uber or somebody just the other day had a new post about it. But I'm sure these things are sort of cyclical too. But where do you see as an appropriate use of microservices, or if that list is too short, where do you see what's the list of where it's not appropriate, at least in terms of things that our developers should look out for?
It's one of those that it's certainly cyclical, and it seems that as an industry we're like jumping from one extreme thing to the other extreme thing. So we've gone for like everything in one deployable box to a million deployable boxes, and both those extremes have their uses. I think there's a better point somewhere in the middle. So Structurizer, let's take Structurizer as an example. So I created it, I started building it 5 or 6 years ago. It was completely self-funded by myself, and I wanted to get stuff out there quickly. In order to get stuff out there quickly with a small budget and a small team, i.e. just me, the thing I'm not going to do is split my architecture up into like 100 different deployable things, which I then need to orchestrate with Docker and Kubernetes, because I just don't have time to do that. I don't have the skills to do that. And it's sidetracking me from my ultimate goal here, which is to deliver something working. So my Structurizer thing is actually a couple of Java monoliths running on Cloud Foundry, platform as a service thing. As I've grown and as I've scaled, I'm now starting to pull bits of it out. now I can hear his audio. So now as I'm starting to scale and grow, now I'm starting to identify things that could be pulled out into their own individual services. So my kind of recommended approach is start with stuff in a monolith, because monoliths are easy to deploy. We have lots of tooling to support monoliths, things like refactoring. So you can rename things, you can chop boundaries, chop module boundaries in monoliths, super easy. Again, just redeploy the whole thing. You don't have to worry about external consumers. You don't have to worry about Docker and Kubernetes and automated server provisioning and observability and aggregated logging and all of that stuff. So all of that stuff goes away. And then what you do is you figure out where might be a good place to have something like a microservice, and maybe you have the majority of your functionality in a monolith, and then the more volatile areas or the areas that you need to scale separately, maybe those things make sense to be microservices, right from day one. So it's a hybrid approach, but I'd on the side of let's put stuff together for simplicity reasons. And I think that actually satisfies, 90% plus of the IT industry. If you're Netflix and Google and Amazon, you've got different problems.
Sure. Well, so with the customers that you've worked with, have you seen any sort of microservices first designs that have been successful up front, or are people still starting in the monolith world and moving up to certain microservices when it makes sense?
I don't think I've seen any. We're going to build microservices first. I've seen lots of organizations who have had their 10-year-old legacy Java monolith, and because they've scaled and the development team has grown, the thing is now harder to look after and maintain. And when they change something up here, all this stuff down here breaks, and they're not really sure why. And I've seen a number of organizations kind of get into that situation, and they think the answer is, well, let's switch to microservices. And so what they do for the next 2 or 3 years, and I've definitely seen this in organizations I've visited, is they go through a phase of kind of chopping up their monolith into smaller things they call microservices. Debatable whether we can actually tag those things as microservices, but that's a different story. And 2 years later, they're like, yeah, we built this thing and it's a mess. And basically what they've done is they've not realized that they need to take a different design approach. Mm-hmm. So they've taken their existing decomposition strategy and their existing domain boundaries and stuff, and they've basically just stuck, in many cases, unfortunately, synchronous JSON over HTTPS calls. So now you've got this lockstep deployed distributed monolith. You can't deploy anything individually. You've got lots of coupling. It's still one big team building it, so you're not taking advantage of Conway's law. So I've seen lots of organizations kind of start with the monolith, want to translate it to microservices and get in a complete mess and then collapse it all back in again.
Yeah.
That tends to be the majority of my experience I've seen.
Who would think that a method call that's moved out of memory and over the network would be slower and more brittle? I never would have guessed that.
Yeah. I mean, networks are fast, aren't they?
The new ones are. Maybe you just need a newer network
and reliable.
Well, so if I'm a developer at a firm, be it a firm that's building software for somebody else, or a firm I'm building line of business apps for my own company. What are my how do I justify to my management that designing the software architecture up front is the time worth spending? I mean, is it purely just a cost play of we're going to spend a bunch of time wasting time just building things, and we should save that time up front and focus on the architecture first for a day or two? Or are there other benefits out there for doing this work up front?
So it's really tricky. I've seen this a number of times. People in organizations trying to convince their management that they want to spend time thinking. They're like, no, just code. We pay you to code. Just go code and deliver, magical stuff. And that doesn't really work. And it's a really hard situation to be in. You've got a couple of approaches. Number one, you just do it off your own back, and then you kind of show the results afterwards. So it's the not asking for permission approach. The other one is you put forward a good case about what it is you want to do, how much time it's going to take, and what you think the benefits are. And often I've been brought into organizations to do that pitch on a development team's behalf to their management, because they were getting so much pressure from the management to just do the agile thing and write code, that they've kind of sent me in and said, right, this is what you need to do, and this is why, and these are the sorts of problems you're trying to avoid. And I think part of this might be that whenever you say architecture, a lot of organizations think, that's going to take months and it's going to be expensive. We're going to have to hire architects and expensive tooling. And I think we need to change that narrative, and we need to say to people, you can do a fairly good first pass of the high-level architecture in a couple of days, and then use that as the basic starting point going forward. And I think that narrative is very, very powerful.
Do you still, but do you feel that companies should invest in software architects in order to make sure that the software is robust enough when they work on that? I mean, not upfront, and not to hire 10 software architects per 10 developers to see whatever ratio, but I think it is debatable now that you should have a solution architect that understands how all the bits fit together in order to be able to write successful software, right?
Yeah, so I'm seeing more and more organizations who have realized that they kind of went too far on the agile thing, and they need to maybe rein it in a bit and maybe put some architecture stuff in place. One of the problems you'll see in the industry, of course, is that when you mention the word architect, people get really scared. And this is why you'll see companies like ThoughtWorks have rebranded their architects to be tech leads, for example. So sometimes if you go into an organization and you say, I'm a tech lead, you get a much better response than saying, hi, I'm an architect. Likewise, you'll hear people use the term architecture owner. So we have someone on the team, like you have a product owner who's kind of driving roadmaps and direction. You have the same person who's doing the equivalent for the technical vision, the technical direction. In terms of people, again, I think 20 years ago, it was very easy to go hire architects and say, we're going to have an architect, we're going to plant them in a nice office and they're going to do magical technical architecture stuff. Even now, you'll get some resistance from some organizations, and there's an interesting cultural thing here. Some cultures are very different to others in that they don't like one person telling a team of people what to do, and they tend to like people being a bit more equal in role. So you'll often hear this expressed as, we don't need architects because everybody's an architect. And while that does work, I have seen examples of that working. And while that does work, it's very hard to do. And a lot of organizations don't have the right people to do that. And one of the problems here, one of the obvious problems, of course, is when you say that everybody is an architect, you're kind of saying that everybody is responsible for the architecture stuff. And what normally happens is nobody ends up feeling actually responsible and actionable. And that's why you get things like security slipping between the gaps. I thought you were looking after security. Oh, it's my job. I didn't know that. Sorry. We're all doing it together. So there's some interesting kind of human dynamics that come into play here. And you'll see this with different cultures in different countries.
Interesting.
So in terms of So in terms of sort of software development as a discipline and software architecture as a discipline, obviously they're closely related in terms of what of the kind of domain that people are working in. But when we say everyone's an architect, beyond just the ownership part of that, what is sort of the delta between a software developer and a software architect in the places that you're working with now?
So the honest answer is it varies. Like every different company has their own different attachment to this term architect. In some organizations, particularly the more kind of bigger, traditional, maybe slow moving type organizations, they tend to see software architects and solution architects as people who, I was going to say lead the team, but that's not really what I want to say here. So, but they're basically in charge of the technical vision. They're making all the design decisions and kind of giving this information to the team, who then go and build it, hopefully with some assistance. That's not my idea of software architects and architecture. So from my perspective, a good software architect is really a developer as well. It's a developer with more experience, and with that more experience, you get to see the kind of higher level, wider picture. So you get to see the whole solution top down. You know where everything fits. You know how everything comes together and works together. You can also look for gaps in things like, so are we catering for performance appropriately and scalability appropriately, and have we thought about security across all the different parts of our architecture? So it's really kind of technical plus lots of wider, broader, high-level experience. That's the easy way to sum up the architecture role, I guess, from my perspective anyway.
That's great, but I think now we found a big problem here in our industry. We don't teach people architecture. I don't know how JP or other people feel like, but when I went to university to study software engineering, there was no architecture module there. There was no architecture course. And I think the fact that we have to build the experience in order for us to become software architects eventually means that we'll build a lot of bad software in order for us to understand how to write the right software. So maybe 4, 5, 6, 7, I don't know, different companies have different notions of senior developers or leads. But for the time that it takes me to get that experience, and hopefully I'm working with someone that has the similar experience and can teach me quickly or mentor me, but it doesn't happen all the time, or people don't have time to mentor in companies. You end up writing a lot of crappy software, making a lot of mistakes, and companies have to pay for that software. So we have this massive technical debt because we don't really take architecture seriously enough to be able to consider it a pivotal role for every company that writes software, and then also hire the right people for the right job. Because I may be very good at writing software, but I may not be good at putting pieces together because I have this kind of specific mindset. You give me a task, I go and do it very quickly, and I do it well. But I may not be able to think the big picture, like how do these things are going to work together, right?
Yeah, exactly. Mentoring and apprenticeships are definitely a great approach to do this. The problem we have in the industry is you'll see lots of senior engineers and developers get promoted into management roles because they see that as the next path in the career progression, which is kind of sad because lots of organizations are actually shipping their best technical people into non-technical roles. So then the developers left have lost all their mentors. So I mentioned these architecture workshops that I do. These architecture workshops, so my background's also working for consulting companies, either building software for our customers or building it with them. So we were in their offices, in their teams, kind of building stuff jointly. And if you work for a consulting company, you hire a bunch of developers. If you want to scale and grow your consulting company, you need more teams so you can go service more customers. Once you have more teams, you need more people doing the tech lead and architecture role. So my workshop actually came from me training other developers in the company I worked for to help them into software architecture roles. So it was actually quite a nice company to work for because we had a very structured career progression framework. So if you wanted to get from level 4 to level 5, there's a bunch of stuff you had to do if you were focused on architecture, for example. So we could teach that stuff. And that's where my software architecture kind of workshops and training has come from. And I've been doing that since, I'm going to say 2006. So like 14 years ago, for example. And initially people were like, why are you teaching this stuff? It's not important. And as we've gone on and as people have kind of reassessed the Agile Manifesto, I think like, oh, this is actually really important. So last year was my busiest year ever. It was just absolutely crazy. Workshops everywhere. So I think as an industry, we're starting to realize that we should put some emphasis back into architecture. And you're exactly right. I didn't do any architecture at university either.
No architecture, no security. We have some interesting questions from our audience. One is, at what level does the architect role belong? Leading and guiding a team on a specific singular product, or leading and guiding the organization, or something else? And how do you avoid the ivory tower architect effect?
So I'm going to answer these questions in the other order because it's easier. So the way to avoid ivory tower architects is to make sure that you are. So let me backtrack for a second. The way to prevent yourself from becoming an ivory tower architect is to make sure you're part of the team building the thing you are designing. So that's great for a number of reasons. It allows you to see feedback and get feedback on your designs. It allows you to work with the team. It allows you to adjust the architecture. And it's easier to lead a team of developers if you are part of that team. So that's the easy recommendation for avoiding becoming an ivory tower architect. In terms of what level does architecture sit at, my focus, and when I talk about software architecture, I'm really focusing on, we are a team, we're building a thing. A thing might be a single microservice or a product, for example. And as that team, we need some technical leadership and technical direction. And that's what the architecture role is all about. That architecture role could be one or many people, different question, but the architecture role is about leading and guiding the team from a technical perspective. If you've got a big organization, you might also want architects kind of sitting outside your teams. And those architects sitting outside your teams might be driving things like technical strategy to make sure you've got consistency across your development teams. It might be looking at product roadmap for the future. You might be moving into enterprise architecture. So, yeah, you do have architects at different levels in organizations. And that's totally fine and valid.
Nice. And how different do you feel that software architecture is now that everyone is, or almost everyone is running on the cloud? like back in the old days, you had your network and you would put like a couple of VMs somewhere there, or bare bones machines, and you deploy your system and it works. But now you got a plethora of options and services, making it super hard to understand how do I build my solution. Like monoliths are great, I get it, but am I going to run on a VM? Should I run as a platform as a service? Should I even look at serverless because it's such a big trend these days? And developers also want to work on funky and new stuff as well. So how do you find these complicating decisions and architecture in general?
I think you've asked me like 3 questions in one go there.
It's an overload. We can break it up. Break it.
So let me answer what I think you've asked me, and then we can have some more iterations of this. So if I'm starting with a blank sheet of paper, now let's imagine I've hired a team and I want to keep the team. You are right. People do want to work on new funky stuff. However, you still need to deliver stuff. So you've got this interesting balance here. I saw someone on Twitter a couple of days ago, and they said what you should do is you should do like a third really boring conservative stuff. It's going to work. A third completely out there new stuff that you want to try, and a third in the middle. And that tends to be what I do as well. There's a bunch of stuff I'll always fall back to, and then I'll pull in new things as I need them. So for me, that's a way to kind of keep the thing spicy and interesting and not boring, and not using completely legacy stuff all the time. But yeah, you still need to focus on delivering stuff. So that's one of the questions I think was in your set of stuff you kind of presented at me. The cloud. I actually think it's the whole architecture thing is like super important in the world of cloud. And I think our lives have been much more complicated by, so take a single app. You're right, you could stick on a PaaS, and then which PaaS do you choose? Because there are a bunch of them. You could go microservices, and then you can throw your services into Docker, Kubernetes, or something else entirely. Now you've got all the serverless stuff as well. I see a lot of people just jumping on specific options because that's what they're familiar with, or they just read a blog post and it was like, here's a recipe, here's a cookbook for deploying your serverless thing to Azure, and people just jump on that, and then they just follow that recipe for everything they're building. And I think we need to make people aware that all of these different approaches are good in their own way, and they all have their own individual trade-offs. And I don't think that's the thing we teach people, especially when you start to factor in things like cost and security. So those are often the 2 biggest ones with cloud, isn't it?
Oh yeah, security, absolutely. I think security and performance, me and JP like to always say that it's an afterthought in our industry. So people will try to get something out of the door, and then suddenly they realize that it's not running as efficiently as they wanted to, or God forbid, it's not secure enough to deal with user data or store data, or data in transit or whatever. So it's definitely a battle that we are fighting here to educate people on how to write the software securely and performant, and at the same time deliver software quickly and fast enough for companies to be happy about the stuff
right.
that that they're building.
But it's a boring topic.
No, it's not.
That's fun. I completely agree. It's not. I find it fascinating, but I think your average developer is going to find that stuff really boring. If you go onto YouTube and you do a search for software development tutorials, you'll get a million people sending you React and Angular and all sorts of cool, funky stuff. You'll see nobody talking about performance and security because it's dull, and they'll have like 3 views, and then they'll be disappointed and never ever podcast ever again. And that's the problem here. We've seemed to have got into this weird situation where everybody's pushing the really flashy stuff, and all of the fundamentals are completely getting forgotten about.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Well, we we work in identity, so of course we know what it feels like to be the boring kids in the room. The buzzkill who's there, and we're like, hey, you guys should really think about this, and they're like, I don't see a React plugin for this, so I'm not interested in it. But but it almost feels like, and I've told people historically that for whatever reason I got really interested in identity, and it rolls downhill, and I couldn't get out of the way fast enough, and so that's why I've ended up doing it for so long. But how much have you seen? How much of if any, of a shift have you seen in sort of the importance of things like identity, especially as customers are looking at public clouds and moving apps out there? I mean, we obviously would love that it becomes a priority for people, but I'm curious as to your experience as to how much that's changed over the last few years.
I think it has changed. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any kind of examples of where we've had identity focused discussions from the customers that I've visited, but maybe so one of the things I do during my architecture workshops is we get people to do a software design exercise, and actually quite a lot of the time people don't think through the security implications of what they've done. So yeah, maybe it hasn't changed all that much. Here's a really good example for you. A group, I think last year, the year before, they drew a diagram, and it had a box labeled Web UI and another box labeled S3. I'm sure other blob storage services are available, of course. And they had an arrow from the Web UI to the S3 box. And I said to them, that looks fine, but what's your Web UI? And they said, it's an Angular app. I said, okay, where is it running? And they said, in the web browser. So I said, well, how is your Angular app in the web browser talking to S3? And they said, oh, there's a JavaScript API. I'm like, I know there is, but where are you putting your API key and secret to access? And they went, oh, that's not going to work, is it? You're smart about things like security. So yeah, maybe it's not.
Well, how much of it is it a I don't want to say responsibility per se, but how much of that is a failure of the vendors to sort of adequately support this, or is it just that it is boring and dry, and for a long time, when you're on prem, you sort of have a limited blast radius compared to cloud. I guess it's quite selfishly, Christos and I have to figure out how to make identity exciting and sexy again. So I'm kind of curious as to someone who's out there and working with customers. What does it take? Like, where should we focus on making identity sort of an important pillar, and security as a whole is an important pillar of these apps?
Gosh, that's a tough question.
Well, good. If you don't have an answer, then good. I don't feel that bad about it anymore.
Yeah.
and maybe it's is there a discipline of sort of software security architecture of folks who are focused on the security implications of software and how it's designed, or is that sort of something we should look to our software architects to be on the hook for?
So yes, is the ultimate answer. People designing software should definitely be on the hook for screwing up, and that goes for all of the ilities, all of the non-functional stuff. I've definitely seen organizations where they have a dedicated security team, and that dedicated security team will definitely go grill development teams as to, have you thought about these things? And sometimes that comes across in the wrong way, but they're actually doing a very, very useful role there. I've also met a lot of organizations where they don't have that, and that's typically the smaller organizations, of course. And people have heard of OWASP, so they're familiar with, cross-site scripting and SQL injection, and of course Troy Hunt talks about that a lot. But maybe from an identity perspective, OWASP doesn't really capture the identity side of things, and maybe because it's not on that sort of radar, people may not remember to do that. I don't know. It's a tough one, isn't it? You just need to kind of get identity a bit more centrally planted, I guess.
Well, it's interesting because, for example, if you transact with us at all, with Microsoft at all, or use any of our properties, for the most part, you touch an identity system, and the vast majority of applications that everybody uses, if we don't know who users are, then the app itself probably isn't terribly useful. At least it has a ceiling of usefulness, maybe.
Yeah.
And yet we still see developers building username and password databases that are ripe for the picking, right? Or rolling their own systems or trying to use something off the shelf. And I'm curious, with the companies you've worked with or the developers you've worked with, we see security teams, and some security teams have the luxury of having sort of application security teams, but it seems like those security teams are a lot more focused on sort of the network design, or the building a moat around apps, or making sure things like secrets are provided for occasional or correctly, and DMZs and things like that. So maybe we're just not to that point yet, I guess. Identity just isn't ready for prime time in terms of people's minds yet, of making them excited about
it. I think it's just hard. It's just it's a complicated space that I don't think a lot of people have got their head around. So, with my structurizer thing, although that was designed like 5 or 6 years ago, that has a username password database basically. Passwords are obviously hashed for bcrypt and all that good stuff. But if I was doing it today, would I do the same thing, or would I use an off-the-shelf identity provider and just hook in? And the answer is I honestly don't know, because it's just a very different way. It just feels weird. So, you've got services like Auth0 and I always get this wrong. Okta.
Yeah.
Not Okta. One of those two. I always get confused. I don't know why. It just seems weird offloading my username password storage to someone else. That's something I think I'd like to keep close by, and I think a lot of people may feel the same.
It's interesting.
Obviously, if you're in a big environment and you've got Azure AD, then you just that's where your identity is. But for small organizations, maybe building products who then get deployed into big organizations, it's a much more complicated story.
That's interesting.
Every time I look at OAuth, I'm like, oh no, not again.
No, that's interesting, because it's sort of a new perspective, especially from someone who's building, building apps alone or in small teams. It's an interesting perspective of, why would I want to give that to somebody else? Why would I want to offload that and pay for it? And of course,
costs. Costs also a big one. So especially if you're a startup and you've got no cash, it's cheaper to build your own data.
Yeah, and we've heard from large places of, this is what are you going to do with my data if you're hosting it, and that sort of thing. And so like I've seen the sort of I don't want to call it paranoid security focus, but folks who say, I don't want to give that data up. I don't know what's going to happen to it when it gets there, or if the provider's going to, how are they securing it, or how are they commingling it with other places, that sort of thing. But it is an interesting factor that I don't think we've really considered in full either, or we haven't done a really good job of explaining why we feel like federated identity and federated systems are at least a choice worth looking at when building something new, right?
I think there's still skepticism around the cloud, to be honest with you, especially in big organizations.
Do you see a lot of federated identity systems, or are people still building their own at your customers? Are they still deploying ping federate boxes and appliances that do things, or are they? Do you see some that are starting to use federated ID?
A few. One of the projects I worked on here in Jersey about 10 years ago, we used federated identity. So I forget the name of it at the time. Active Directory ADFS.
Oh yeah, AD Federation Services. Yep.
Yeah. Yep. It was horrible. It worked, but it was just the most complicated thing on the planet, I swear.
Well, and I mean that's a lot of it, right? Is that the identity industry as a whole probably hasn't done itself a whole lot of favors in terms of it's quite esoteric and lots of custom vocabulary and
You need to understand it, right? If you want to use it, you need to understand it. And nobody wants to spend a lot of time understanding how identity works or authentication works. All they want to do is just plug it into their solution and then move on to the next task. And I think this is our challenge here. Because, to understand tokens and life cycles and refresh tokens and what happens to my API and how do I validate the tokens, it's a lot of, there are a lot of steps involved in doing security correctly. And I think most of the developers don't really want to go into the depths of the beast and try to understand it. So what they do is like, how can I quickly plug this in and then move on to my next task?
Yeah.
And if somebody questions my practices or whatever, then I can come back and fix it. The problem is that most people don't come back to fix it, and then they end up in the news. So it's the entry barrier. Make it lower for everybody else to be able to use it, and then people will come. So that's a challenge, JP. Make it easier.
Yeah, the first time I ever integrated SAML 2 into one of my apps, I did the same thing. I'm using Java and Spring. There's a Spring SAML extension. I just want to plug it in and magic happens. And guess what? It didn't work. So I literally had to go and like every SAML 2 tutorial I read started with, well, here's an IDP and this is what, oh my goodness. And you literally have to go through all of the terminology in for like 5 minutes. And then you can get into actually doing what you want to do. But once you get past that, it's relatively straightforward. But you're right, there's a huge barrier entry just jumping into the whole vocabulary and getting your head around that context.
Yeah. We did a stream last week where we took another streamer with us, and Lila was brilliant because we actually implemented business to consumer, Azure AD business to consumer with her app. It took us an hour and a half probably, or maybe an hour to set up the Azure AD B2C and explaining what the different bits are and why we need to do them, and maybe a couple of lines of code. So for us, it was another day in the office, but for people actually watching the stream, it was like a lot of boilerplate work that needs to be done in order for the application. And as you say, once you have that boilerplate stuff done, then it becomes much simpler in your application to do it. So understanding how to do that and how many steps you need to perform and what have you is the challenge there, because not everybody wants to spend an hour up front setting it up. You only set it up once, mind you, for a solution, but at the same time, it's an hour that could be spending writing code or writing tests or doing other stuff. So we get it. I mean, fundamentally, we get it.
You also got lots of choices, haven't you?
True.
You got SAML 2, and you got OAuth 2, and you've got JSON Web Tokens, and like, where do you start?
Yeah,
you're absolutely right.
Well, and there's still a lot of software that's under active development that is still using SAML 2, and SAML 2 has been around for ages and is falling rapidly out of favor, partially because it is confusing and difficult to implement. But so many packages that people depend on, or if they're starting from a platform, that package uses SAML. It's the only way to integrate with it, for example. And so then it's like, well, we got to use SAML for this, and it's just a big barrier. I mean, we've made the development experience itself, I think, fairly straightforward and fairly painless. But once you're to the development stage of your project, you've already been through an hour of configuration, and that's knowing what to configure. And it's that's the thing that confused me most. Actually, was the configuration of which of the things on the configuration page do I need to put in my app. Right, and the direct developer experience of using a library and letting the library sort of handle signing users in or getting access tokens to go talk to other services. I think that part is relatively well off. It's the administrative experience to get there that seems to be so confusing it's confusing for us. I mean, we can go through and jump into the portal right now and there'd be things that make us all scratch our heads. So. Even when you do it every day. So,
well, maybe hear me out. Maybe we need identity architects. And we can work with Simon there to create another course where we explain to people how to do identity as an architect.
That's right. Hey,
I think there are people doing that already.
There might be.
Yeah.
There might be, yes. Yeah, I think there are, but maybe not enough because we still see a lot of bad stuff out there. So
because it's boring, nobody wants to do it.
Well, it's job security, right? But no, we see a lot of identity architects, but they are very much some of them are software developers or former software developers, but I'd say, at least in my experiences, the majority of them do not have software backgrounds, and that's why there's sort of an impotence mismatch between an identity architect and someone who's building identity code, someone who needs to integrate that into their application. So
right. That's a great way to come off as an ivory tower architect. So just make this magic complicated identity stuff work, please.
There you go.
So, I mean, there's a lot of work that they do in terms of understanding how it all plays into corporate systems or into the larger sort of enterprise, but it's very difficult.
Someone has to, because most people don't care.
They don't care. Yeah, they do. So. They truly don't care. But again, we want to prevent companies making it into the news. And with Troy Hand declaring last week that over 10 billion records have made it into his database, it seems that as an industry, we still have a long way to go until we actually get the point that we build good performance, secure software that does its job. I mean, that would be fantastic, but 50 years, we're still trying to get to the point. Maybe we need some kind of a standardization, like doctors, where, you need to do this job if you meet a certain set of criteria, because otherwise, to be honest, it actually self-perpetuates. It's an industry that, senior developers will come and fix stuff that other developers have built because, they didn't write the good software, so we always have something to do. But at the same time, I like to quote James Whitaker, that he says, imagine if as an industry we didn't have to deal with bugs on a daily by daily basis, and we didn't have to work with the minutiae of the software engineering, and we're able to focus on the big things like curing cancer or sending rovers to Mars, and everyone in the industry could do that. That would be fantastic. But unfortunately, the reality is very different from that ideal situation.
Yeah, instead
I was talking to...
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I was talking to somebody about this topic, I think last week, and I think in Canada there is a movement to certify software engineers because the whole engineering term, and part of me thinks that's actually a very good idea, because we're making this worse. This is a bit of a controversial take, but bear with me for a second. Because software development, it has a very low barrier to entry. You just need a computer, and then open source software, off you go. Because of that, and because of the number of boot camps that are springing up, teaching people how to be quote unquote full stack developers
in 5 weeks, mind you.
Right, in 5 weeks. That's how a lot of people get into the industry. And I'm not saying they should go to university and stuff, but we need something around that. We need some more discipline. Maybe having people certified is not the way to do it, but there has to be something, because it's just going to get worse.
Yeah, I mean, I remember seeing a discussion about what I guess was called the expert beginner, and it was someone who had been at a place for a very long time and had a breadth of things that they had worked on, but was never really deep in any of them. And the problem with that is as those people stay at places for a long time and get promoted into senior developer, principal, managers, that sort of thing, which of course a good plumber doesn't necessarily make a good manager of plumbers, but that's a different discussion. But then you end up, that gets passed along, because so much of it is tribal, and so much of what you learn is what you've learned with the folks that you work with. I mean, I went to college for music ed, and I wanted to be a band director, and I started working at a software firm and thought, I kind of like this better. So I absolutely see the need for some sort of just baseline of expectations, because some of what people are building is critical software, and especially if you're hiring a consulting firm, or you're hiring externally for it, and you don't necessarily know sort of the backgrounds of the folks who are going to be building that software for you. I mean, it's a sort of a huge liability. It's a huge risk.
Yeah.
In fact, I remember Troy, he had a few articles around a company that had built these, they were like stuffed animals, teddy bears or whatever, that had, they were internet connected, which of course is like the first.
Oh, yeah.
And people would send messages back and forth to their children, like if they're traveling or whatever. And all of the audio leaked, and these are super personal messages that kids are saying to their parents and vice versa. That there's got to be some sort of, I don't know, there's got to be some sort of standard baseline to say, like, to where you kind of can know that sort of stuff, if it happens, would be because of a series of unfortunate events, not just we put an empty or a clear text password on an Elasticsearch instance and threw it on the internet, right? So I'll get off my soapbox now. So
Yeah. And that happens a lot as well.
Yeah. So
I think we're at time. So maybe Simon, what are your your thoughts about the industry, and maybe let's close with a positive comment there, going from certifying every single developer out there to slightly more optimistic and more exciting stuff, and we can close.
Exciting stuff.
Yeah.
Architecture and exciting stuff. Oh my goodness. Save the toughest to last, huh?
Yeah.
I think we are getting better as an industry, and there's lots of good stuff going on, and we're certainly able to deliver stuff a lot quicker than ever before, just because the level of abstractions has shot up, and that's very, very good. But we are still a fashion-driven industry, unfortunately. This is why we always have that dig about microservices and serverless, because it's fashionable and trendy, and people want to work on it. I don't know how we solve that. I really don't.
Better education, I suppose. It's a good start, and having people that understand that probably. I mean, I don't have the answer either, but I'm thinking that if you have solid people that can make good decisions when they decide to write software or implement something, then it usually helps. I work with some really intelligent people that always resisted the urge to go with the latest and greatest, but at the same time, they had a good notion of what works and what doesn't work, and sometimes they would delve into the unknown and the exciting, because we needed to try something new. You need to learn new stuff as a developer, but you need good people to lead. I think that's very important.
Yeah, it's having that balance, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can't just jump on the latest and greatest of everything, because you are going to fail at some point.
Well, I like
it's selling that in a way that makes it make sense, and not we have to do this boring stuff because we're boring. It's balance.
Like identity, security, and
software architecture. Apparently,
and software architecture.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's all part of the same bucket. Whenever I do my architecture workshops, we always talk about performance and scaling and security, and oh, okay, that sounds interesting. Are you going to talk about security? No, it's a massive topic. Sorry. I don't have time, and I don't understand our feed.
Yeah, I ain't got time for that. That's great. Well, I want to thank Simon once again for joining us today. I mean, it's great. We had an amazing conversation. I loved every second of it. Hopefully our audience did. Some people commented out saying, thank you for joining us. It's great office hours today. So I appreciate that.
Hey, welcome. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Thank you so much. And you can check out...
I'm not sure we've righted anything.
Huh?
I'm not sure we've righted anything, but it's been fun.
No, it's fine. It's fine. It's educating and talking about our opinions. I think it's great.
Yeah, because
thank you.
Because of course that's what the world needs, right? There's more opinions on the internet for other people to listen to, right?
Yeah. Well, when they come from leading experts like Simon, I tend to listen, but
that's true.
I wouldn't listen to myself.
So you can find Simon's website at simonbrown.je. And Structurizer is in the top link, as well as his book around called Software Architecture for Developers. You can read more about the C4 model out there. So thank you so much for joining us today. It was a great time. Went a lot longer than I expected, too. It's even better. Thanks, everybody. We will be back in probably about 10 minutes, and I guess we're going to maybe we'll build a React app that talks to Azure Blob Storage.
There you go. All the hype.
See ya.